never stolen anything from anyone. Never taken a product from a shopping center that I had not paid for. Never snatched an item from a friend without properly asking for it. Never even thought about gracefully sneaking $1 or $2 away from an authority figure or a parent. Never has my hand gripped something, touched it, and collaborated with my mind in order to take it without fair intent. No, I have never stolen anything. However, there are the little things. Every now and then I will pass by an unsuspecting couple, holding hands and trading tiny little mumbles of lies to ensnare one another deeper and deeper into a pit of doom and inevitable defeat of a human's loyalty. Truthfully, I've never stolen another heart that belonged to someone else. I'm not a homewrecker in any sense of the word. But the little things are sometimes just so easy to take that I don't even realize that I've taken them until it is too late. Good afternoon. My name is Caitlin Marici, but anyone who knows me calls me Penny. I'm an English major working to get my teacher license by the time that I graduate. The excerpt that I have just read for you is a part of my favorite work written by none other than the fabulous me. This was a short piece of fiction that I wrote for my creative writing class back in my sophomore year. As you can most likely tell, I adore writing about tragedy. I love to see the faces of my readers as they connect the dots to figure out the harsh truths that I've implanted in my pieces. I love to feel the melancholy sadness that floods me when I add depressing bits to my larger works. I've written for as long as I can remember. Some children played with dolls and action figures, but when I was a little girl, I wrote stories and read Nancy Drew books. Of course, my writing has changed over the years, but I believe that all of my history has come together to help me choose my path to be an educator, leader, and teacher to those who need that guiding hand. And hopefully I will be an inspiration to thousands of students. I went through more than most children did as a newborn. Without getting into too much detail, I dealt with my personal issues, and after years of therapy, hiding behind my mother, and letting the world push me around, I finally developed into what I believe made me the woman that I am today. I became a writer. I wrote about dogs, I wrote about fantasy lands, and one day I wrote about death. I love death. Where many people tend to avoid, fear, or hate death, I find myself intrigued by it. I will admit that it was weird when I was a child, but that love of death forced me to branch out into other topics, such as heartbreak, torture, bitter endings, and so much more. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, you love horrible, weird things. Where's this going? Well, I'll tell you. The Little Things, as I said, is the story that the excerpt I read for you came from. Of course, this is a rather tame piece compared to my larger works, but I believe that my writing style does need to be able to fit into a high school creative writing class, as this is what I will inevitably one day be teaching. Fingers crossed. The Little Things is about a narrator recalling moments in time that they have taken without necessarily realizing it. Those little things could be interruptions to a stranger's phone call, running through a couple holding hands, or snatching away the attention of someone from their darling dearest. The narrator then goes on to admit that sometimes they take those little things on purpose, and then even accuses the reader of taking those little things too. Depressing, I know. In a sense, the piece is meant to represent the fragility of love and peace and how quickly it can all be destroyed. Now, what does this simple piece have to do with a high school creative writing class? Well, for my senior project, I compiled a few of my other works with 5 lesson plans to make a unit of short stories to teach to a class of my own future students. A lot of my plans were made with the idea in mind that I would have already been established as the teacher and my students would have been writing for some time. All of my stories contain deep or tragic messages. The idea of learning from short stories is to gain that message. Most of the messages pushed through the short stories that we learned as children were simple ones, like in Little Red Riding Hood, Don't Talk to Strangers, in The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Avoid Lying, and in The Tortoise and the Hare, Slow and Steady Wins the Race. Part of my lesson plans for one of those days involves sharing that idea with the class, and then having them come up with a few other short stories in groups, and working together to come up with their messages. These stories are meant for them to be thinking about what they would want their message to be if they were to be the authors of their own original short stories. Each of my days transition into one another and gives the class the chance to take what they've learned into a new day, and thus they gain the skills and knowledge necessary to begin working on their own short stories. The majority of my lesson plans work together to head towards the class creating their own original short stories, and then presenting them in a PowerPoint to the class. They're expected to present their actual story, the characters, the meaning, and the message behind everything. I created guidelines and small exit tickets every day. This is the 4th day of my lesson plans. I added my own words as a reference for what I expect from my students. I prefer to teach with the mindset of, I wouldn't ask you to do something that I wouldn't or haven't already done. My skill in already being a writer is what's going to help me push forward to knowing my students better, because research shows that students learn better when they interact with one another and the teacher, rather than just a teacher lecturing at them for hours on end. If I were to stand in front of them normally, they wouldn't exactly be comfortable with sharing their words. However, if I do the exact same thing I expect of them, it eases the tension a little bit. They don't have to be the next Shakespeare or Stephen King, but I want them to be able to branch out of their comfort zones. Speaking of comfort zones, when I was in high school, I hated talking in front of people, ironically. The idea made me stutter, avoid eye contact, speak really fast, and sometimes cry. If you hear me stuttering, you know why. Freshman year was a changing point in my lifetime. I had a wonderful environmental science teacher named Mrs. Leanna Sarkwell. She had us present in front of the class every week. Every week. Could you imagine? To a freshman with social anxiety, that was the equivalent of sticking your hand into a vial of acid. But Sarkwell was able to work with us. She gave us breathing techniques, visual cues, and slowly began to help each and every one of her students push out of their shells. By the end of the year, our final project was to create a music parody video that we sang. Mine was Reduce, Reuse, Recycle to the tune of Taylor Swift's Trouble. I admit I hid in the back of the class, but I was still able to do that. I want to be that teacher for other students. I still keep in contact with Ms. Sartwell to this day, and I love her for everything that she did for me. I want to be the teacher that is able to help students push past their fears and come out on the other side stronger for it. That is why I expect my students to be able to stand in front of an audience of their peers and speak about something that is most likely going to be extremely personal to them. This is relatively what I expect the final presentation to look like. I expect the lessons they wanted to teach, the character analysis, and the explanation as to why they wrote what they did. At the end of the week, after working to complete their own stories and presentations, they will be reminded that on the following Monday, they will present their works. While this is a small unit plan, it is something that I rather enjoy. Most people think that short stories are simple and easy to write, but to make a complex and interesting piece that forces the reader to think, you need to be able to have the skills to do so. All of my lesson plans and smaller works can be found here on my Google Classroom. As you can see, there are different things for my students to look at and different works that they are responsible for, along with exit tickets to reflect on things that they would have learned in class. I spent a lot of time wondering how I was going to end my presentation. I spent well over a year working on stories, PowerPoints, lesson plans, and essays, and yet I had no clue how to sum up my skills. That is, until I decided to share this piece with you. Without further ado, enjoy Above the Water. Life is often a rough patch of creatures that wrap their coils so tight around our throats and force the dread of pain and failure into our gullets. These creatures vary in shape and size, color and weight, scales and thorns, and power and stature. They often group together in order to put their varying powers to greater use, but there are those that stand alone. There are those that we tend to avoid because of how useless but addicting their talons and coils can be. Chains that force needles deep below our skin so that they can never be removed. There are more than we've ever been able to count, and I doubt even I will be able to present them all, but I will try. They call themselves the Saviors. We walk to the edge of the land and notice their shiny peepers viewing us from the water's edge. They start out small. They tell us that we're horrible creatures and the only way we can ever be forgiven for our horrible crimes is to die. They sugarcoat their little tales and lies that by the time we realize what the creature has done, they're already sinking the tips of their long, slimy tentacles into our skin. I've watched from afar as the creature was able to gather herds of innocent beings into its trap with the accusation of crimes, the worst one imaginable, living. They say it's better to die, and we believe them. They call themselves the Solvers, providing little drops of their own bulbous and bloated skin to the beings that choose to follow them into the water. They're some of the most repetitive creatures that I have ever seen. They all begin the same, small, insignificant, and offering just a taste of freedom that the supposed cleansing waters can offer. We follow them because their skin is sweet, or smoky, or crisp, and we believe that we need more of them. They grow the more we harvest and feast upon their flesh. They seem to suck all the life from their hosts as more and more of that flesh is consumed. It is sick to watch, but I will admit that I've seen a perfectly ordinary man turn into something so frail and bony that he was moved by the slightest of breezes. The creatures finish off the beings by then opening their giant gullets and kissing the water that the person is just barely floating on, sucking up the last of whatever was left. They never truly solve anything. I admit that I had tasted the sickly sweet tang that one of the beings let slip from its side when I was not watching. I picked it up and felt it gloss my lips with the sugar crystals. I felt that chill down my back when you're doing something that you know you're not supposed to. The way the little glob fell down my throat, sucking at my lungs as it passed, made me gag, and I could only half understand what was happening as I began to choke. The glob hardened as I bent over and coughed it up. The little piece seemed to suck at the grass, searching for the meat that had just been enveloping it mere seconds ago. When it could not find what it was searching for, it scrambled back into the ocean, and I stood astonished, watching just to be sure nothing would be coming back. They call themselves the victims. Some of the creatures that we fear seem to fear us just the same. One of the most fearful is a shadow that floats, zips, and jumps from all sources of light. They're the ones that creep around our homes, watching from the unlit halls, smelling our distrust from the darkness. I can only imagine what they do when they finally build up the courage to strike. The only evidence they leave behind is this beautiful home, filled to the brim with pictures and ideas of what the person who used to inhabit it was. It is a creature that hardly has any victims because the young ones who populate their world are just as shy as the children they stalk, but the older ones are much more noticeable. They take the shape of many fears that adults attempt to hide from. The larger the shadow, the more potent their effect. The more fearless the shadow, the less likely it is you'll be able to survive. The more resilient you attempt to be, the less likely the shadow will believe you. It is a game of cat and mouse for most of our lives, but the creatures have a way of finding our weakest moments, remembering every little sick trick in the book in order to kill us slowly. I understand so many of the creatures from the water, spewing their tales and lies more than they could ever produce, but I don't understand the humans that fall for their lies time and time again. The idea of this wondrous thing we call life being taken away by something that looks like the equivalent to what one would find on the bottom of their shoe after a rainy day is preposterous. I've seen the creatures far from shore, and they're the ones to actually fear. Nevertheless, I do not fear the creatures or the ideas of the creatures. I do not fear anything that comes from the water. I fear nothing because I am able to fly high above the water. I can picture it now. The feeling of floating upon a light breeze, soaring against the raging wind, and piercing the clouds, drifting back into the open air once they've smelled their cool waters upon my skin. Spreading my arms wide and running my fingertips through cold, freezing air sends shivers down my back. I look down to the water and I do not see the creatures, though I am only a good bit above it. I do not see the creatures, but I do see the reflection of the setting sun surfing over the waves and giggling with the crashing of said waves. I dip down, skimming just over the ocean's surface, and I dare to look deep into the water. No creatures reach up to touch me because they know that I am untouchable. I am the one who soars, and I am the one who observes. I am above the water. Thank you all very much. Are there any questions that you all have for me? Oh, come on, I need at least one.
Okay, Penny.
Yes.
This is a very basic question, but what was your favorite part about doing this project?
Honestly, sharing my stories, because a lot of them are ones that high school me would have never been able to do in the first place, because obviously they're kind of personal, but I love being able to do that because that's what I want to do with my future. I want to be able to share that with other students, and I want to be able to get that from them, their own creative outlets, you know? So I would say that was my favorite part.
And do you have some favorite writers, short story writers that you enjoy?
There is one. I think it's only his writer's name. Dathan Arbat. He wrote Pen Pal, which was a compilation of memories from his childhood, where he was realizing that he had practically used his whole life. If I had to be rather basic and say famous author, I really do like Edgar Allan Poe.
Since you chose to grace us with a Rat King,
Of
I'll
course, he was here to
ask
support
the
me.
question I always ask you. Cartooning?
No.
Thank you, Kim.